Welcome to the Politics People. My guest today is a writer, a broadcaster, a hugely influential political voice in the UK and beyond for the past 4 decades. He's a Perrier Award-winning comedian and was one of the first alternative comics to achieve crossover mainstream success. His new book, The Power of Difference, is required reading for anyone interested in the impact of diversity. I've been trying to get him on the show since it started. He's here today. I'm talking to SimonFanshaweOBE. Thank you for doing this.
Hello, gosh, I can't wait to meet me. I sound fascinating.
I know it's quite a I mean, in all seriousness, actually trying to boil it down to an intro for you is kind of because you want to keep correcting stuff with you. It's like, yeah, well, he does, but then he doesn't do that. You know, it's just because to a lot of people, obviously in the UK, you know, you are a telly and stand-up comedy face. But actually, that's always just been the front of house. You've got so much wiring going on behind you. It's fascinating to delve into it.
Well, I think the truth of it is I've never had a job. That's the first thing to say. I've literally never had a job. And actually, the work that I have been able to have, clearly I've never been able to hold it down. So I've had to kind of change the whole time in order to be desperately opportunistic in what is laughingly known as my career. So, yeah, I've done a lot of things. I've said to people before that I feel like my life is like a clock. You can see that it has moved, but I don't see it moving. So it turns out 7 years on, I'm sort of not what I was 7 years before, and it's sort of osmosis. It's nice. I like it.
Yeah, it's I came from representation in the stand-up industry. That's kind of my opportunism, how I managed to, grab onto other people's tailcoats. But that's where, I mean, this is the thing. You can't overstate the impact you had being from the alternative circuit, winning the Perrier. What was that, 89 did you win?
Yeah, 89.
So this is winning the Perrier in the 80s, when it was still the Perrier, before it became a bus ticket or whatever. And but you went to BBC One. You were the first to do this, and I just think that there's such a public consciousness about you. You are that guy. I mean, you did the show That's Life. If we got American listeners, actually predominantly, sort of American and rest of the world listeners, That's Life was this huge. What would you describe it as? It was a huge Sunday evening variety consumer show, basically.
It was a consumer show with kind of peppered with sort of comedy stuff. And I mean, Esther Ranson, who was is it really? She was it for years and years and years. I think around for 18 or 19 years. And, she is an extraordinary woman. She's also funny. And that's one of the places she started, with sort of writing sketches and stuff. Look, surfaces on playgrounds that kids fall onto and it doesn't kill them, seatbelts in the back for kids, Childline, internationally known now as the place where you ring if you've been abused or you're having, a difficult time as a child, and so on and so on. She is responsible for starting all these things. She's extraordinary, and so I found it interesting to go and work for her. I only did 1 season, but yeah, it was fun. And then I sort of gave up stand-up actually, and started doing something else.
Yeah, well, I know this is what I was going to come to, but it's more the fact that, again, by stealth and talent, etc., you ended up. It was a consumer show, but it was a staple of the BBC. This was massive. This was a massive show. This was a massive backbone of the BBC Sunday broadcasting. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get to with that. Was I always thought that was remarkable. Without really effing and jeffing, you were able to cross that. I didn't get into the stand-up until 1990 at the end of. And there was still an idea that the alternative comics wouldn't be able to cross over to the mainstream. Not only did you do it, you did it before anybody else was even looking. I just always thought that was a remarkable thing that you did.
Well, I think it was like, what I suppose was interesting was that I didn't really think of it at the time, but it turned out that, being out and gay and just, out bloke in a suit sort of thing, that was unusual. And at the time, it didn't occur to me that it was unusual, because I'd sort of, if I was going to go and do stand-up, I was going to go and talk about, life and me. And then, so of course I would talk about gay things. And then I had to find a way of doing it. I once, in the middle of the 80s, I went to Canada. I went to the Just for Laughs comedy festival, and then I got booked, and for 3 or 4 summers I used to go to Canada and appear in this set of comedy clubs called Yuck Yucks, and they're still there, you know, across Canada. And I really had to work out how to talk my way into a suburban audience for whom the mention that I was gay was an absolute silencer. It was just hilarious. I mean, you know, I would mention it, and then you literally, there would people at tables going, "Sorry, did he just?" You know, it was really, and you thought, why are they doing that? It's very bizarre. It was just very unusual, really. And I did sort of, so I wrote my way into that and found a sort of silly way of doing it, which I won't repeat now. But I found a way of talking, getting to the stage where they thought I was funny. So in other words, buying a bit of permission, then mentioning it, then taking the piss out of their reaction, and then carrying on. And that was a step by step. And I kind of learned that from Esther. Esther always said, you can't go from there to there. You have to go from there to there to there to there. You have to build steps in broadcasting. And so things like that were kind of fun. But it was an interesting time to be a comic, because you could be a comic. You know, if I'd been in the 60s and I had any musical talent whatsoever, I would have been in a band, or maybe I would have done what you did. I would have gone run a band, you know, or managed a band or something. In other words, you know, it was possible. And it was possible because of what was going on in America, and, you know, the Comedy Store and that style of comedy coming over to Britain. And then it was possible, really, because of Alexei Sayle. I mean, you know, Alexei is the big daddy-o of this stuff, and he invented a form of comedy which was completely different from anything ever anybody had seen before. And it was full of amazing childish anger, which is a staple of comedy. I mean, the angry child's an absolute staple of comedy. But it had a kind of political punch and a no apology about it that was extraordinary. No one had ever seen that before. And it opened doors for us to find a voice that people hadn't necessarily found before.
So you were very much more conscious of using, if you like, you saw the zeitgeist at the time around comedy, and you were, it doesn't sound like the way you're describing that you're a dyed-in-the-wool comedian, that you had to be a comedian. There was a lifestyle and exploding scene, etc., that could help express other parts of you that could be useful to you.
Yeah, I think if you look at this sort of, you know, that you gave it a charming coherence, but if you look at this sort of, you know, the ghastly sort of pointillistic sketch of what's laughingly known as my career, what you'll find is one theme that you will find that emerges from it is this notion of advocacy. Yeah. And I always put it down, my mother, an upper middle class lady, because I always have this thing, people say I'm very middle class, and it always annoys me because I'm upper middle class. But my mother once said to me, darling, she said, the very least you can do is make marmalade for the fate. Yeah. Now, that is a very patrician way. And for those Americans and others listening, the fete, the garden fete, is a June, July staple of all villages and small hamlets in Britain, where in the big house...
I think for the Americans, you're also going to have to explain marmalade, I'm afraid. It's
marmalade as well. But, you know, this idea, and I've always interpreted that as you need to get stuck in. You know, there's an obligation in the world. Don't be a bystander. Don't do nothing. My absolute, you know, the thing I can't for, whenever I do get asked to do stuff for, you know, schools or whatever, I always say to them, the one phrase that drives me mental is whatever. No, never whatever. No, never, oh, I can't be bothered to think about this. I'm not going to make up my mind. No, actually, you do kind of have to pitch in. And I got that definitely from my mum and dad. And I think comedy was a way of doing it. I think journalism was a way of doing it. I think activism was a way of doing it.
It's like that noblesse oblige thing, isn't it? It's just like you do, there is some obligation on those who have the gifts and the position to be able to roll up their sleeves and help or do something. No, well, that's what comes across. Like I said, it's like I deal with a lot of comedians, obviously, and on this podcast I'm talking to people who are influential in politics, and some of the comics, for me, and again, I don't want to project, but you see comedy more the way I do. I think, you know, it's just like, oh, okay, that was the cultural boom, if you like, at the time, and that's the wave to ride. And then I deal with a lot of people who then subsequently are still trying to get back to 1987 or something. And it's just like, let's have it all over again. No, that's now definitely gone. We are now dealing with the remnants of that. You can dive in now and you take part in the world as it is, but they sort of are nostalgic for some kind of halcyon days of stand-up. And it's just like, I was always impressed I could see what you were doing, basically, and I was always impressed by that. And my savage kind of representation head, it's like, why did you not stick around to really cash in more with the comics? Because you started the gentrification, if you like, of the alternative comedians.
Well, I think the reason I didn't stick around, when I look back, and I often have this thought when I think of Julian Clary, who's remained a close friend through a really interesting relationship. We've had we've had a lovely relationship, but interesting and up and down, jealous of each other's things, I think. But
no, I think you can pretty much take that as a given. Yeah.
And I think that's great, because we're very, very different. What I was going to say was that what Julian had and will always have is this extraordinarily instant understanding of his impact on the audience. He absolutely understands what he means to an audience, how they read him, and it's what makes him such an extraordinary performer. He's completely in control of it, and it's wonderful, and it seems instinctive, and I think he learnt it socially, but I think he absolutely understands how to put it on stage. So I've always watched that and marveled at it. I didn't understand essentially my relationship with the audience in a way that I now do.
Oh, interesting.
So now when I find myself in front of, I did a speech before lockdown, it's an after dinner speech, in front of the straightest crowd, really, still. But actually, I know that now. I know how to do it. I know when to do it, when not to do it. I've learned that instinct, but it took me a long time. And so consequently, when I was doing that stuff in 89, 90, I couldn't work out who I was. And so I'm not surprised that telly didn't pick me up further or whatever, because I never really worked out what that relationship was. I came to that understanding quite late, I think. So I think it's quite easy, I think, when you grow up gay. In fact, growing up gay screws you up, because you grow up it's nothing to do with being gay, it's to do with the context of being gay. So you have to go through something of an arc. And there's a brilliant book, I love it, called The Velvet Rage, which slightly annoys me in the sense that it's written by an American psychiatrist, and so it's full of gays having brunch in California. So you just have to skip over those bits. But the essence of the book is great, which is basically that growing up gay fucks you up, and you have to deal with the fact that it damages you. And I've always loved that. And I think it's taken quite a long time for me to deal with it. And I think underneath that relationship with the audience lay a kind of defensiveness with the audience that took me a long time to get over that. So I think when I gave up, I think it was it had peaked, and I was still actually rather scared of the audience. And I think that was probably somewhere in the sexual orientation bag. So that's me psychoanalyzing myself, but I think that's probably what was going on.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And again, it's like, the chicken or the egg, isn't it? It's like, do you start off with that kind of predilection that then you transpose onto the comedy world, the career, or is it the other way around, basically?
Well, I think I go out there constantly testing, whether or not they are going to reject me. I used to say, I've got two types of friends. I've got people who like me and people who change their mind. So there's a real insecurity in here which wants to hate myself. And it's taken me a long time to deal with that. I mean, how much are you charging per hour for this, by the way? Because this is like psychoanalysis. Thank you very much.
Oh no, we're never putting this out. Don't worry, nobody's ever going to get it.
No, put it out. I mean, if it's interesting to other gay people listening, I'd be interested to know, whether they relate to that idea. Yeah. It's all very well chanting and going down the streets with the placards saying gay is good, but actually inside, if society hates you, and I don't mean your parents or your family, but if society rejects you, or the atmosphere rejects you, you're going to have to deal with the fact that you've grown up in that context. And by the way, if you're Jewish and you grow up in an anti-Semitic context, or you're black and you grow up in a racist context, etc.
Yeah, well, I definitely, there's an anecdote in the book that's about you taking the badge off I want to get to in a sec, but I was just going to say, in a really crass way, so now you now have some kind of, like ABBA, you have some context of your career. I can't speak for ABBA. I'm not allowed anymore, as you know. But so you now have an overview of your career. Are you going to go back? You could go back. You could go back and do the public figure performing stand-up.
I would really enjoy that. The difficulty with it is that you really have to put a lot of investment. Writing a show takes a lot of investment.
Have you seen your book? What are you talking about? Your book is like it's like War and Peace already. I mean, if you're prepared to do that, how long did that take you to book? This is this fantastic book. This is it is going to be a real must read. It is, and I don't say that with many.
Well, that's very, very kind of you.
It's the power of different. Well, it's called The Power of Difference, and you came at this in a completely different way to, I think, the way that the reader might assume before they pick it up. And I'm not going to praise you. You're better at that. But what's fascinating is like it's so dense in the amount of actual kind of pithy content. But what I was going to say was that you must have started writing it years ago for it to be that exhaustive.
Well, it took me the lockdown, which here was 6 months. That was on March to sort of the end of September, really. What's that? March, May, June, July. Yeah, that's 7 months. It was on the tip of my tongue. You know, I mean, it really is the filtering of a lot of different experiences, personal experiences. So who am I? You know, white, upper middle class, you know, posh bloke, lefty, you know, sensibly in the early 80s and late 70s, you know, intellectually kicked in the head to great effect by feminists and people of a completely different social background to me, basically saying, actually, you need to deal with this. You need to think about this. What is it? What does it mean being a man? You know, all that kind of stuff. Fantastic. I mean, God, could I have had a better teacher than Sandy Best, a lesbian that I worked with in the early late 70s, who just used to torment me. I love her, by the way, but she just used to torment me because she just did this thing. She used to put me under pressure. And then she used to say, you know, I said, why are you doing this to me? And this is long before the makeup people came up with it. She said, well, you must be worth it. She'd wander off. Well, she never wandered anyway. Actually, she bustled off in a sort of butch lesbian way. Do butch lesbians bustle? I think they probably march.
Some of them do. So they
bustle in a marching way.
It's a grey area, I think.
But you know, that was a brilliant starting point. So the book is partly about what does that mean and how's that developed. It's also about, I think there's a whole set of things that I have learned from other people when I have been thrust into campaigns, whether it was the Stonewall gay equality thing, whether it was stuff that I've been involved in around what's known as forgiveness, but I like to put a question mark after it because, you know, this is when something catastrophic happens to people, whether it's their child is murdered, their husband, their wife, their partner, their whatever, or their child dies in hospital through negligence, or they get raped in a context like, you know, Srebrenica, or you know, whatever, these awful things that happen. And what is remarkable about the stories that the Forgiveness Project, this project I'm associated with, has done is gathered together, is these people finding a way through that stuff. And I found that endlessly inspiring because the brilliant thing is they don't agree with each other because you can't agree about these things, but you can find a way together through them. So I learned tons from that. And I've learned tons from people who've written about diversity, really. And again, you know, the idea that all of this stuff is based on a very fundamental idea, which is that we are all different. That actually the way we get along with each other is not forcing each other to agree with everything we think about. It's all about understanding our differences and therefore what we can collaborate on through those differences. And I don't know how people who behave in this kind of ideological sort of snowplow kind of way, you know, if they are in partnerships, I don't know how they decide what movie to go and see.
No, quite. Well, look.
How do they compromise? Because every man knows you have to go and see a chick lit film, and every woman knows you have to go and see a whiz bang bollock film. That's just the way it happens. That's heterosexual partnerships, but it happens within gay and lesbian partnerships as well, because there's always somebody who likes either. Do you know what I mean?
Listen. I completely. The culture until very recently was men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or vive la différence, and it was live and let live, etc. People would be acknowledging of the diversity of individual human nature. This is the thing. This book that you've written is basically flying in the face of this new orthodoxy, this sudden orthodoxy, where no people aren't different; they are exactly the same. And it's interesting that you're coming from, bearing in mind, you're one of the founders of Stonewall, if I'm correct.
Yep.
And you've recently, I believe, severed links with Stonewall and helped found LGB Alliance. Is that correct?
Well, I didn't help found it, but I have been publicly critical of Stonewall, not actually because of a stance they take. They can make their own decision about the stance they take. In this particular case, it's this idea of self-ID in the trans debate. So the idea that you can simply say, I am a man, I am a woman, and that feeling of who you are is what is primary. You can take that view if you want. I don't happen to, but that's not my point. My point is that there are two very different views here, and that the legacy of Stonewall and the way we made change was to talk to people we didn't agree with and to try and find out what we could agree with them about and focus on that. So one of the things you find that, for instance, when you talk to people who are religious or people who are maybe homophobic or whatever, actually don't talk to them about what they think about homosexuality, but do talk to them about what they think about certain groups of people being unequally treated by the law. Because actually, frequently, they think, well, that's not fair. And whether you're homosexual or not, that's not fair that you're singled out and treated unequally. That's a way of forming broad alliances. So my argument with Stonewall is not about the position they take. They're entitled to take any position they like. My point was that it has implications. And you have to be prepared if you're going to take a position on, as we did in Stonewall, gay parenting, equal age of consent. You've got to be prepared to go out there and argue and listen to people's anxieties and dissent from it and find the common ground that you can in order to make the bigger case. And that's what they've not done. But they're part of a much bigger political context in which people are not doing that generally. So what people are doing now is that, and you can find this in America, you find it here, they're laying down codes of language, codes of behavior. And actually, the thing about human beings is we need to blunder about a bit. And the reason we need to blunder about a bit is that's how we learn. You don't learn from being made to conform to a set of rules. So you've got this bizarre idea that diversity has become now a tool of conformity. But the idea of inclusion, which by its definition is based on an idea of difference, I mean, otherwise, why would you be trying to include people unless what you were trying to do was say, oh, they're different. So what can we do to make sure they feel, included through their difference? The idea of inclusion is now turned into, you've got to speak like this, think like this, and behave like this. And if you don't, we'll exclude you.
Well, I think that's what comes across in the book so effectively, is that ultimately what you're saying is just like, no, you should, this current approach of homogenizing identity, opinion, etc., is actually going to be counterproductive. It's just like, if you'd have let people rub along and sort of, feel entitled to their faux pas and tread on one another's toes, eventually we actually all end up with some kind of consensus. Whereas this idea of the indoctrination is actually going to backfire massively, is my takeaway.
No, I think that's right. And look, what this is also about is building a level of confidence in managers or in parents and children, or because this stuff does take a certain amount of relaxation. I know that I've learned. I mean, I learned writing the book has been extraordinary because it's just made me think and expose myself. And the one thing I never do is hold myself up some kind of paragon in this regard. So I was doing a session, which I do, and I did it online the other day with about 40 people. These are within a big global company. They are from South Africa, this lot were from England and Scotland, and there was 2 in the Arctic. So you probably know what sort of company it is, but I won't say. Right. And so we're talking to them about this idea of leading for inclusion, I call it, okay? And I made a stupid joke about having been to Newcastle that week. And I made the stereotypical joke about full of women, you know, not wearing tights and, no, you know, just T-shirts with a pack of cigarettes in their hand. And somebody in the group just put their hand up and went, isn't that stereotyping, really? And I went, yes, good challenge. Thank you very much. Let's talk about stereotyping. You're absolutely right. And what we reached an interesting conclusion in the discussion was that had I said, stupid Southerner me, I was the only person wearing a coat. Actually, in a funny way, the joke probably would have worked better and we wouldn't have had the discussion. But the point I'm making is the carelessness with which I just reproduced that stereotype gave rise to a discussion. We spoke about stereotypes. Yeah. We're about to move on. And I just said to the group, I just want to say one thing about this brilliant challenge. I now feel quite vulnerable. I'm leading the session. Here I am. I'm apparently Mr. I now feel inside, I feel a little bit odd inside because I've messed up. That's what happens when we challenge each other. It's not easy. You can get the, you know, the worries. So it's important to acknowledge that. And it was really interesting in the feedback. I just did it because I thought I'm going to tell them how I feel because that's interesting about dynamics of challenge. Yeah, it was really interesting. That discussion came back in all the notes they wrote about the thing because I had blundered, we had learned, on we go. I learned. I mean, you know, the challenge taught me something.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yes. I mean, I always, I mean, I'm just horribly right wing, and I would like I'd have probably just defended the stereotype. But I'm like, I just think there was a period in Britain, talking about Britain specifically, where all the kind of, you had such a culture after the war of so much was, you know, the variety theatres, the variety shows, TV, everything was such a post-war. People had like rubbed together in the army, you know, similar class. You had guys sharing spaces and becoming, you know, soldiers together, if you like. And part of the lingua franca, if you like, was this kind of, now it would be called xenophobia or intolerance, but it was the stereotyping of one another. And actually it created more of a bonding by being, you know, it to the simplest level of like, you know, Taffy and Jock or whatever. And it actually helped with, I believe anyway, with social cohesion. I just think that a lot of the class and culture that is sort of, what can I say, that they are propounding this kind of indoctrination, they've never actually had to share their space with anybody different. And so they're coming at this from a very kind of clinical pontificating point of view. And actually on the ground, we've been diversifying for years quite merrily. And now you're taking away the kind of the icebreaker that we used to use.
Well, look, I think there's two things about it. I mean, one is that stereotypes do arise from some truth. And so there is a shred of truth in them, but they grow from truth to the point where they're then misused. What happens is they get literally sort of, they get molded into a truth which is supposed to describe a whole group. And the truth of it is it doesn't describe a whole group. So in a sense, what happens is that the truth, as it grows up, it starts to be molded into something that's actually rather negatively potent. You know, it's damaging because you get lumped into something. So there's always an ambiguous element to stereotypes, but there's something very different about being a group of people who know each other well and using those kind of things, and being a group of people who are in a much more formal situation, like work, for instance. So the problem with it is that you don't know the effect that it's having on people unless you're careful about that.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I mean, I think the key thing, it's not that you walk, the key thing is not to walk on eggshells.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also in not walking on eggshells is not to take the other view, which is I don't care, I'm going to say whatever I want, no matter what the impact it is on anybody.
Mm.
So what I'm saying is that the value of this is a kind of discovery that you will make if you don't just skate over it. You just take the time to think about the impact of your behavior or your comments. So whilst it might work between a bunch of mates who do know each other well and might have risked their lives together or whatever, actually, when you're in a work situation, I've heard it time and again, people think that they're having a jolly bantery time, or they think that everybody's feeling very much in the family. Actually, when you do the stuff that's confidential and ask them to tell you how they feel, if you're not in the family, it's very excluding. So that's the problem with it, is it does create a bond, but the problem with bonds are amongst groups of people is they also exclude people. So you have to be conscious of whether or not actually what you're doing to bond with A, B, and C is also accidentally excluding people E and F. So that's the dynamic, and that's fundamentally important at work, because the minute you start to exclude them, what you start to do is you start to not listen, and then you don't get the benefit of what they can bring to you and to the joint enterprise.
Absolutely. And again, that's, but that's the ongoing nature of group dynamics. It's just like this current approach. And again, I'm not one that's kind of like, oh, every cancel culture and, political correctness gone mad. It just seems that the cure is worse than the disease, if you like. It's just like they've actually now made people afraid to communicate anything. And so whatever, if you take your faux pas, if you'd have actually, you expressed being vulnerable subsequently, but if you'd have actually, consciously made sure that you didn't say it for reasons of not wanting to, basically for whatever motive you might have to not express that point, surely then it's that kind of culture where you would be so self-consciously not trying to say, elephant, that you don't fully engage in that group at that time.
Yeah, but there's two things, because you're absolutely right. There's a balance between the self-censorship, which is kind of walking on eggshells really means, doesn't it mean? You don't say things for fear of offense or whatever. So we can't not say things for fear of offense, but it is worth thinking about and understanding. So let's take another situation. So men will say, can't I compliment a woman on what she's wearing at work? Well, what you have to think about is what's a compliment. And compliments are only compliments because of the way they're received, not the way they're intended. Now, I'm not saying that intention is not important. Intention is important. Intention is the difference in murder and manslaughter. Intention is a very important concept. However, when you say something to a woman and you want it to be a compliment, you have to know that the way it's going to be received is pleasurable. And if actually women are fed up with being talked to at work about their shoes and their dress and want to be talked about the way they ran that meeting or the project they did rather brilliantly, that's the compliment you need to think of. So in other words, we have to hear the fact that somebody says, do you know what, I thought that was sexist, it wasn't a compliment. But you also have to hear the person who says, well, I didn't mean it, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And that's the point. The point is that's when we get to understand each other, and that's when you get to learn from each other. If what happens is the person here just says, you're a bigot, and the person here then just goes on the defensive, well, where are we now?
Exactly. We have a standoff. Well, this is again, but this is why. This is my old manager head. This is why you're in the perfect position. I love posh people because posh people have had this kind of manners drilled into them often from early on. I mean, there's a whole thing where you don't even mention anybody's appearance. That's the whole, I love the stuff with the Queen, when they say like, I think there was a story about Margaret Thatcher's office contacting the Queen's office to see what they would wear. We didn't want to clash, and then it came back, Her Majesty never notices what anybody wears. And it's there are there's a bunch of etiquette. There's a bunch of manners, rather.
Well, there's the famous story, isn't there, about Queen Victoria, when I think it's Queen Victoria, when, you know, some farmer came to lunch, you know, just these private lunches or whatever, and, you know, the bread arrived and the soup arrived, and he picked up his bread and tore it up and threw it in the soup. Everybody's like, oh. So Queen Victoria picked her bread up, cut it, you know, tore it up and threw it in her soup. So everybody picked up their bread, and the farmer, the farmer never knew. Yeah, there's something very right about attempting to put people at their ease, but there's something very wrong about colluding with people if they're being racist or whatever.
No, absolutely. Well, this was what I was going to say. I know it might not. I make effortless look really labored, but you see, if you combine the posh thing with you coming to, it's not even you came through comedy, you came through alternative. And the fact that the alternative thing, there's so much of it is quite simply, you know, it's the purest court jester. It's just like, yeah, but is it though? Is that? And that seems to be the kernel of most alternative comedy. It's just like people will say, "Oh, it's all right, everything's all right, she's having a laugh, we're having," and then the alternatives come along and just go, "Yeah, but is it though?" And that's really it. And you definitely have melded those two together. I'm saying, I think, not unlike ABBA.
And I love that exploration of jokes. I mean, the endless question that one got asked questions about this, and people still do it, you know, to Ricky Gervais and people like that. Is there anything you can't make a joke about? And I always gave the same answer. The answer is no. It's not the subject, it's the joke. Jokes are only jokes if they're warm and if they've got some humanity to them. They're not if they're just nasty. People might laugh at them, but I think that's the point at which we go, well, okay, they were funny to that group of people, but let's think about the motivation. So it's the type of joke you make. It's not the subject you make it about. So I've always felt that. And I think that this challenge is interesting. But the trouble with the challenge at the moment is there's a sense of, we are putting you right. It's like, no, that's not how challenge works. The point about challenge is that you challenge, and then there's a response, and then you listen to each other, and then you try and find some interesting concoction out of that. You know, you try and you think, oh, well, that's interesting. Won't do that, then we'll do this. Or I'll give you an example. So I had a really interesting discussion in a session I had with a client the other day. And the thing about the book is that, you know, when I say call it the power of difference, there's a reason to call it the power of difference, because that's everything you deal with in human groups, okay? So really interesting discussion. So the head of this department, or the college as they call it, his parents were killed in the camps. His grandparents, were killed in the camps. His parents are Holocaust survivors. He lived in Austria, then they moved to Australia, then he moved to America. Obviously, if he lives long enough, he'll go further down the alphabet, but to start with, that's what he's done. And so he now lives in Britain, so he's gone to the B's. So he lives here, and so he has this profound sense of the Holocaust and the position of Jews in the world. And it's what a Jewish friend of mine calls, and I always ask Jewish friends of mine this, I said, do you have a suitcase in the hall? In your mind and your imagination? And this George said to me, yes, I will have a suitcase in the hall. And I said, do you feel safe in Britain? And interestingly, he went, yes. It was the pause. He wasn't just, I teased him after, I said, we've just been Jewish. No. It's my favorite visual joke, is sometimes people think I'm Jewish, and I go, I wish. So anyway. Well,
Labour are 9 points ahead in the polls, so I'd be worried if I was him.
Yeah, well, we hope that Labour have knocked that one on the head. But anyway, let's just go on with the analogy. So we've got George, okay? On the other side of the table, a group of about 8, there's the guy who's the head of politics, brought up a really interesting dynamic. He said, now look, I think if we ran a politics course on the politics of the Middle East, could we do that without risking expressions of anti-Semitism, which would put Jewish students and others in an extremely difficult position in terms of how they felt and what they thought? And as George then said, well, when I hear that, I know where that leads.
Right.
So we had a fascinating discussion about, could you do that? Should we always take on in a university every clash, every difference, every exchange of ideas? Is there a price to be paid? In other words, is that is the damage that potentially could be caused, nonetheless a price worth paying for the real hope, for the hosting of a real exchange of ideas, etc., etc., etc. And what was wonderful about the discussion was it went round and round.
Yeah.
In other words, there isn't a right answer, but there's a conscious discussion to be had. Now, that sense of, and George wasn't saying this at all, but that sense of I am hurt by what you say is not the same as I am unsafe, and it's not the same as saying I am harmed by what you say. So hurt and harm are different. Feeling and being are different, and so on. And that's one of the difficulties, I think, in a lot of this, is that the subjective has become the power in the room. Enough to say, I feel X, and at that point, you gain a credibility, apparently, which then excuses you from the examination of any of the evidence that there may be around the particular incident that happened.
Absolutely,
and that's very, very damaging. So my point is, it's not that people are cancelled. They're not cancelled. I mean, when you look at the people who've been removed from things, they're often high-profile people. But what the effect of that is that actually, because they've been bullied, they have some protection because they have public profile. It's everybody else that doesn't have the protection who feels bullied, and that's why they then shut up. I would say you get silenced or you get sacked.
No, I listen. I think that is a great analysis of it. I'm more concerned as the ultra free marketeer that I am, that I really want to protect the free market of ideas, because they self cleanse practically. You know, there've always been outliers in any group. There's always going to be, you know, the people with extreme views on either side. My worry about the homogeny that's going on in unaccounted and unaccountable institutions at the moment is it's who is deciding what the acceptable language is. And if history shows us every single time, it's even one of the ends of the Soviet Union, that when you don't clearly explain to the populace what is in and what is out and why when they don't have any say in what they can say. Look at, you know, Jordan Peterson. You know, he's become an international icon just from saying, like, yeah, I just don't want this one line of code saying that the government can compel my speech. You know, it is so onerous to people that the idea that somebody can have control over your speech, that becomes very explosive, and the targets of it ultimately become Jewish people on the ground, or gay people on the ground, or black people on the ground. That's what it does my head in completely, because on the whole, people rub along quite happily together, and history has shown us that. It's whenever an institution gets involved is when it all explodes.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there are sort of two elements here. One is that I don't talk about academic freedom any longer, for two reasons, really. One is that sounds to me like academics have some kind of freedom that none of the rest of us have. Yeah. Actually, no. The second thing is that it feels to me, watching some recent clashes, that the defense of somebody who is being bullied out of a job or of saying something, the defense of academic freedom sounds to me like, oh, well, what they're saying is absolutely ghastly, but I nonetheless defend the right to say it. And then you go, well, would you defend a Holocaust denier? Would you defend a race scientist? And I think that's a daft set of questions. I would rather say that what I defend, particularly in universities as a core purpose of universities, is the exchange of ideas. Mm-hmm. So when I was chairman of a university, which I was for 6 years, I was chairman of the governing body of Sussex University. And it's interesting, I reflect sometimes with the then Vice Chancellor, we reflect on the thing that we felt most powerful in the institution was the exchange of ideas. So when we came up against questions of controversy, or speakers that were asked, we always said to them, well, nobody gets a platform just to argue what they want to argue. What they get is a platform with somebody else who disagrees with them. And that's got to be what happens in universities, you know. Now, people out in the big wide world will always find spaces where they can just rant to their supporters. But what I'm saying is, when you want a solution, when you want it to legislation or you want it to a social issue, what you've got to do is have discussion. You can't just have preaching to the poor because actually what happens then is it's just uninteresting, really.
Well, exactly. And often, it's not as you said earlier so eloquently, there isn't a right answer. It's actually the process of people figuring out, it humanizes us all. If you can, as you've described, express, well, I now feel vulnerable, etc. Everything, it helps humanize strangers to one another.
Well, I think that's right. And not everything that has a discriminatory or hurtful effect is bigotry. No. So I think of behavior in language really in three ways. I think of it as careless, thoughtless, or malicious. So when it comes to malicious behavior, I mean, that is absolutely unacceptable. If somebody's going to stand up in public and say women are less clever than men, or black people, I mean, this is a quote from an HR director, it's black people are no good at administration. I am not prepared to encounter that. I mean, I'm happy to, if they really want to argue about it, I'll argue about it. Look, hello, here's the data. Here's the data. So you could do that. I think one's in a really difficult position when there's no evidence and they're just expressing an opinion. So you find that there's one of the stories in the book that I use as an example of this, which is the story of Derek Black. Derek Black was born into white supremacist royalty in America. His godfather is David Duke, who is his mother's first husband, etc., etc., etc. He was the great young hope of white America, and he was the sort of acceptable, stood in an election where he never mentioned, race or whatever, but stood successfully for a council seat in Florida and won. He then went to a university, and he decided that he was not going to say who he was or share his opinions with, because he knew, he went to the local liberal arts college, so he just knew what would happen. And sure enough, the inevitable did happen. Then they found out who he was. There was this massive protest, and they tried, thousands of students, and they shut the university down, and everybody said, "Let's get rid of him." And somebody said, actually, no, I think we should engage with him. And one of his colleague students, and they had ended up singing a bit of country and westerns together earlier on, which is quite funny because he's a white supremacist and the other guy is a Jew, so that's kind of funny. He asked him to his Shabbat supper on Friday night. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing to do. You discover somebody on your campus is a white supremacist, not just happens to be expressing racist views, but is actually running a website for young white supremacists. And your response is to ask them to Shabbat supper. That's extraordinary. And then Alison Gopnik, who was one of the people who went, stopped going to the supper because she thought, I don't want to do this. I don't want to encounter this guy. And then she missed it. So she went back and she discovered that this guy, Derek, kept on coming back. And she couldn't understand him. So what did she try and do? She tried to. And she makes a really interesting comment at one stage. She said, I think he just said, I hate black people. I wouldn't have been able to deal with it. But he kept on producing evidence that he wasn't using properly. So I could produce counter evidence. And that way we started to have a discussion. And he said, well, she wouldn't let me not talk about it. She kept on pointing out where she thought my evidence was wrong. And he said, eventually, I started to think, well, I respect these people. What am I getting wrong here? And then he wrote this thing for the Southern Poverty Law Centre in which he disavowed his background. But by the way, he maintains, he's still part of his family.
Yeah.
So this is complex, so the context was there, the curiosity was there from Alison, but he wanted to change. There was something in his motivation that wasn't happy with where he was.
It's a great look. That's a great illustration of exactly, I think, and that's why it's included in the book, of what the problem is. It's like, it's not the ideas, it's not the exchange of ideas, it's not the people. It's that there is some unseen referee that is saying this cannot be expressed, and that is in itself verboten to even express these things. And so people sit on their hands and no exchange of ideas. And if the Renaissance teaches us anything, it's just like, no, it's the expression of ideas is the point. It's like, get stuff wrong is great.
So then what do we do with the fact that people are saying, I'm sitting in a room, I'm the only black person at work, and what I hear, nothing is ever big enough. No incident or use of language is ever big enough for me to if I make a complaint about that, people are just going to poo-poo it, you know. But drip, 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 drip. I find myself constantly outside and being, you know, and that's real. That's an incredibly
It is, absolutely.
It's very common for women in male environments. It's very common for gay people, especially if you're not out. It's very common for black people and so on and so forth. And what people are saying is, I want to express the fact that this is genuinely hurting and harming and upsetting and offending me. So what do we do about that? What we have to find some way of doing, I think, and I use this phrase, which is we have to listen to hear. So in other words, we have to listen to the validity of the expression of that hurt or upset. But that in and of itself cannot be the process that we then use to find a way through it, because we can't run a family, a relationship, a team, an organization on the basis of felt allegations. You just can't do it. You know, everybody knows is in a relationship. If somebody says, you know, that really upset me, you did blah, 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 blah. Well, you've got to make a decision, haven't you? You either divorce or you find a way through it. How do you find a way through it? Well, you have to try and understand why that upset your partner, don't you? You have to do it. Otherwise, you won't ever find a way through it. Or you turn into kind of ghastly marriages where there's just sort of sullen silence and people say, I remember there's a British actress called Maureen Lipman who told me this story about, she said that she saw a couple at a table in a restaurant and they didn't say a word to each other. And when the dessert menus came, the woman picked up the dessert menu and she went, and the man said, "Oh, the desserts, dear." And she went, "No, the last 25 years. So you can end up there if you want. But
yeah. But it is the. But again, it's just it's the same echo for me. It's just like, look, when majorities and minorities meet, there's always going to be an adjustment, a massive period of adjustment. The problem was, if you give the example of that drip, drip, drip in the workplace, the problem was an imbalance of power. And so you have an imbalance of power, and therefore that can breed, it's not even intolerance, but it can certainly breed ignorance. Yeah. People don't assume that the world can be different to outside their majority view. We're just, from what my humble position, I just think we are now replacing one majority intolerance with another majority intolerance, but it's just because it's like of a different stripe. It's now acceptable. It's this, we aren't. I was at Mandela with South Africa. I always thought was really interesting because his take, I mean, he and Mugabe went through similar imprisonments from colonialists, etc. But when he came in, he did the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. It was as you're expounding, it was the hearing of things that was in and of itself cathartic.
It's interesting too. In order to go to the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I know I put some of this in the book because I think I agree with you. I think it's an interesting anatomy. There are two things that had to be true. One was that the crime that you committed had to be related to a political situation.
Go on, sorry.
So there were two preconditions to this. The crime that you had committed and were going to talk about and explain had to be in some way political. Okay, so in other words, you couldn't just say, "Oh, beat somebody up," or "Oh, I stole a loaf of bread." No, this actually had to be a crime that was in the context of the apartheid regime and so on and so forth. And the second thing was that you had to admit responsibility for it. Mm-hmm. So that's quite interesting. You see, so already what we're saying is that in order to make this work, there's some parameters to it. So for instance, the bantery one or the, I'm just going to say, actually, no, you have to accept some accountability to the hurt that other people feel. But what you don't have to do is then submit yourself just to their subjective point of view.
Yeah.
But the way you get through it is not arguing with their feelings. You can't argue with a feeling. If somebody says, "I'm hurt, I'm angry," you've got to say, "No, you're not." That's just stupid. I mean, that's just daft. You say, "Oh, you're angry? Tell me why."
Yeah.
Because you can't argue people's feelings. Having then told you why, you can then say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause that effect on you. Oh, well, I'll think about that. Thanks very much. Or whatever. In other words, you've got to be accountable, but so have they.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's accountable to each other. And that's the thing about work, which is quite interesting, is that it's rather different from outside. In the pub, on the street, you don't have this sort of containment. Whereas at work, you've kind of got this containment. So what you've got is you have got some kind of common purpose. I mean, you are supposed to be able to work with these other people and sort of achieve this thing, whatever it is you've decided to achieve. So in a sense, that's ultimately what you're accountable to. So when I write about work, to some extent, I'm already creating some parameters.
Yeah.
And it's much more difficult to do it without those parameters. Again, in a relationship, there are parameters. Mm-hmm. If you want the relationship to work, well, you're going to have to work at it. Mm-hmm. If you don't want it to work, well, split up, fine. But do you know what I mean? If you decide it works, well, that's already putting some parameters in the debate and the discussion.
Have you... Because again, this everything you're saying is so it would seem common sense, but it is, you are in a nuanced way slightly different to a lot of the herd, if you like, on this subject. Have you experienced any sort of negative repercussions from your positions?
Yes, I mean, I think people a number of things. Well, so one, yes, absolutely. One lot of people say, that the hurt. If you're arguing that hurt is harm, then actually you've dismissed what I'm saying, because I'm saying hurt is not harm, and that actually being hurt or offended, that's part of the deal. And the only way you get through that is, as I say, challenge and then blah, 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 blah. So if people think I'm dismissing the hurt, and I'm clearly not, I'm saying you need to hear it. But they do that. The difficulty with arguing with a lot of people is that the very stance they take precisely precludes the argument, because they feel that this has got beyond argument, and actually the other people have to shut up, actually.
Yeah.
So this phrase that you see on Twitter is educate yourself.
Yeah.
And this is sort of incredibly patronizing thing to say to people. If what you mean is, like I described the feminists in the 70s, early 80s with me, they bothered. And as far as I'm concerned, thank goodness, because they changed me. They opened my eyes to stuff. So so where you encounter resistance to this is when people don't accept that there's potential for an interchange. They just think that actually that's what you do. You have a rule, you establish a rule, and you exclude everybody else. And what I think they're discovering in most of these things, whether it's about race or whether it's about gender identity or sexism, or what you discover is that there's a pushback to that.
Yeah.
That actually action creates reaction. And you see that a lot these days. And that they're quite shocked. So what they try and do is paint the reaction as being conservative, racist, homophobic, transphobic, whatever. Actually, when we're serious about it, that doesn't really wash. Because, as I say, not everything that somebody says is necessarily bigoted. There are lots of different grades of that. And actually, there's some things that people believe that it is perfectly legitimate to believe. It's just that you believe something different. So if you're going to do that, then if you're going to construct a world that's based on one or the other, or a combination of both, you have to work out what the implications are of what you each think. And then, especially when it comes to legislation and stuff. So the opposition is just actually, and without trying to caricature it, the negativity comes from a refusal to encounter the other ideas. And the only way you can do that is to dismiss them. It's an old shock jock. I mean, this started at shock jock radio. I mean, it started. One of its early origins is shock jock radio in the 80s. This is Rush Limbaugh and that kind of. So the deal there wasn't to argue with people. It was to delegitimize their point of view. You're a liberal. That was enough. All you had to do was say you're a liberal. That was it. You're a, and I mean, that's an old style, isn't it? You're a black loving white person. You're a, straight loving gay person. But it was to delegitimize that. And that's now been taken to quite a dangerous extent, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think you've definitely captured that in the book. I was I was genuinely really impressed with it. I was, I could give who gives a shit what I think, but I
it's
was
very nice of
impressed
you to
with it.
say, because it's always jolly, because you put these things out in the big bad world, and I guess it's I've never had children and I don't want to have children, but I imagine it's a bit like having a child. You want people to like it and think that it's very pretty and one day will be a ballet dancer. That's what you want people to say about your children, isn't it? So you sort of want people to take the book and go, that's really very lovely, well done you. And what I do hope is that it's not just a description of the problem, but it genuinely suggests some ways that people might practically go about doing this. Because what's happening at work, particularly but elsewhere, is that people need some confidence to tackle this stuff. Because it does take a bit of confidence to say, actually, no, I don't believe that, I believe this. And I'm not going to be belligerent about it, but that's what I think. Yeah,
no, that's wonderful. And so, what is next for you then? I mean, this is obviously the best interview you've ever been involved in. It certainly is the best. It's the best show that we've done. It's the best episode of the Politics People.
Well, you obviously need to get a better list of people to talk on it then. I mean, if I'm the best you've got and I'm sub-regional D-list, then I think what you need to do is kind of climb up the ladder a bit. But set that aside, it's been very enjoyable for me to have an option to sort of talk about this stuff, because I am genuinely compelled by this idea that actually difference is what matters in life. I mean, I'm married to a Nigerian Muslim. Hello. My sister says to me sometimes, she says, why have you never gone out with, she's older than me, why have you never gone out with people who are like you? And I go, how dull.
Yeah.
You imagine having me in the house. I mean, it's hard enough having me in the house when you're different from me. Having me in the house to be the same as me would be ghastly. So that's a good thing. But I clearly have got from somewhere this idea that difference is really important. And all the great stuff that I've seen in life is about people trying to wrestle with their different experience of a situation or whatever, because that fascinates me. And so what I've really enjoyed, so I want to go on exploring that really and seeing if there are other practical ways. This was in the context of work. What I think, obviously, what we've got to try and do is turn this idea of difference into much more of a social movement. We've got to get to a place where in social media, people go, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Oh, good thought. Let me come back.
If only there was some.
Saw a tweet that said that. I mean, wouldn't you fall to the ground and kiss the earth?
Absolutely. If only there was some, I don't know, stand up of some description with some kind of profile that could like champion that. That would be amazing. Well, you've got to take it back on the road, man. You've got to. I mean, look, if you look at Badil with every book being turned into a West End show thing, you've got a tour in this.
It would be fun. My very favourite producer, actually, who could have done this, died unfortunately at Christmas. Wonderful man called David Johnson, who was one of a kind. But yes, I would love to do it, I suppose. I would. Oh, I know I'd love to do it. I know I would. I just need to, yes, I just need to write it now, don't I?
You do.
I need someone to write. I would love to do that. What's next, though, is that, I mean, I will spend a lot of time doing this, and we have a business that's built on this. What is mentioned in the book and the clients that are mentioned in the book, it's built on this set of ideas that we've been developing. So I'd like to go on working with clients and achieving that change in the world. And I think, to be honest, what I love is when I go into a client and I start talking to them and I suggest some of these ideas, and I think, well, we could look at this, or we could examine that, or why don't we take the executive through this process? And that will give them some chance of trying to deal with that. It's just great because people go, oh yeah, that would be terrific. And I do this thing called towards an inclusive leadership. It's a session I do. And people really like it, which is where the stereotype discussion came up. And when I first started doing it, this really nice woman who was one of our clients wrote to me, and she said, before this session, she said, I thought it was going to be where all the pink and fluffy stuff was. And now we've gone through this session, she said, I realize it's where all the muck and bullets are. And I love that. So I kind of sometimes call it the muck and bullets session, because I really, really find when people trust each other a bit and they really start to talk, actually they do start to explore, and it's so rich. It's so rich if you can get people to understand a bit about the impact they have on other people and the language they have on other people and the cultures, the way cultures clash and so on. So that is so exciting and rich. The thing about my husband and I is that, I sound like the Queen, don't I? My husband and I.
Not anymore.
We never know why we don't understand each other, because he's Nigerian, he's Muslim, and he's younger than me. So, and he's black. So there's 103 reasons why we might not understand what each other is saying. And it's great because when we sometimes frequently will say something and then the other will take something out of it that the first one didn't mean. And then we realize quickly that we're not in the same cultural territory. And it's fascinating because we keep constantly having to unpick. Oh, you don't. Oh. The great one was when he draws beautifully and likes painting and art and stuff a lot. And so we do that a lot. So we were watching a documentary I saved once on Lucy and Freud, and I thought he'll love this. And after about 5 minutes, he said, "Who is this guy? He's just extraordinary." And I said, "Oh, he's Freud's grandson." And my husband said, "Who's Freud?"
Wow. And
that was early on in our relationship. And I suddenly thought, oh, this is interesting. So there's something psychologically about me, but I do think I'm projecting onto the world something that's kind of a given about humans. And so that's what so what's next? I want to go on exploring this, but you're probably right. I would probably love to write a show about it. I like being on stage. It's a very nice place. Yeah. Very nice place to be.
Well, there's a bunch of people selling tickets on the back of your initial endeavors. I'm telling you, you want to go in there and nick yourself some of that living back, I tell you.
You think that? Yes, I can see it now. 17 nights at the Apollo. Ha! It'll be the back room of some pub where the owner's got a bloody Alsatian that wants to fuck your leg. And he's got a much younger wife who's wholly inappropriate. And so it goes on. And he sweats. And he's but he needs some cash.
No. You see, you see, the point is, it's like, you know what you're geared up for. It's like you do it, the Brighton Comedy Festival, you do a one night, and then you'd stick it in the Soho Theatre in London, and you'd be all over Radio 4. You know it.
Do you think, oh, that'd be fantastic? I have a dressing room, which is kind of mink-lined jacuzzi.
Yeah, it's yes. I mean, this is why you're such a pro. It's just like you're going straight to the rider.
Oh, I'm going straight to the rider. Absolutely right. I mean, Badois. Don't have Perrier any longer. That's long past. We're not having that any longer. Yeah, straight to the rider. And I love those things. The riders are so ridiculous, aren't they? I remember once. I mean, we never had a rider when I was touring. You're lucky, to be honest, if you got a cup of cold, warm cider and a plastic mug. That was all the awful thing. But that was the thing about comics. There is this thing about comics where you do go and it is awful and the dressing room leaks and you're sitting next door to the heating pipes and the stage manager is a complete asshole. And so it goes on and they don't pay you any money. And famously people say to you, what was it like? You go, well, it was a gig.
Exactly. Well, that's it. I mean, look, that's the note to end on, isn't it? You are the natural for finding us an out point. Yes, it was a gig. That's what hopefully historians will describe this interview as. But yeah, listen, I appreciate your time today. This has been absolutely exhilarating and enlightening, and I can't thank you enough for talking to us today. SimonFanshaweOBE.
Well, it's very kind of you. The thing about the OBE, which is I was pretty taken aback by when it happened. But my favourite story about it is that the woman who designed our business cards, I have a partner called Roy, business partner, and we have the same card, obviously, and our name is different. And she rang me up the day before it went to print. She said, "I'd just like to ask you something." She said, "You've got OBE after your name." And he doesn't have OBE after his. Should he have OBE after his? And I went, No, he doesn't have an OBE. And what I really loved about it was she clearly had no idea. And I really liked that. It's like the Queen doesn't notice other people's dressing. Well, I like the fact that the woman didn't notice the thing of it. Yes, back on the stage, Paul. All right.
That's what we're doing. Simon Fanshawe, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Pleasure, real pleasure. Thank you for giving me the platform, actually, because it's great getting this stuff out there. And if people want to respond or whatever, there's the website, Diversity by Design. Give me a shout, give me a talk, tell me what you think.
I'll put the links in, and I'll put a link to the book. Is it Amazon?
Oh, buy the book. That's, of course. Sorry, I should have said. Available online, you know.
It's like his first day. It's ridiculous. Yes, buy the book.
You know, but do that. But seriously, the ideas are what matters. So people's stories, people's encounters, what happened, did it work, didn't it work, how can we do it differently? That's the stuff that I love. So please send it to me, and thank you, Paul, very much indeed for entertaining me and my ideas.
Bless you.